It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend at the lake, a chance to enjoy the summer sun and cool water. But some lakes hold more than just water, they hide secrets. These 7 true stories from lakes around the US will make you think twice before dipping your toes in again. Lake Lanier in Georgia is known for its recreational beauty, but it's also notorious for its dark history. Over the years, there have been numerous drownings, and many locals whisper that the lake is cursed. In the summer of 2012, Mark and his friends decided to take a weekend trip to the lake, hoping for a carefree weekend on the water. The sun was shining, the air was warm, and the lake looked inviting as they rented a small boat. As they glided across the water, the mood was light. But as the afternoon wore on, Mark started feeling uneasy. The water, though calm, seemed to grow eerily still, and the temperature dropped suddenly. Mark brushed it off as a change in the weather. But his friend Rachel was more sensitive. She began noticing strange ripples in the water, like something was moving beneath the surface. She asked Mark if they could head back, but before he could respond, a distant voice called out from the water. It was a girl's voice, weak and desperate, calling for help. At first, Mark thought it was someone else, but as they looked around, there was no one in sight. Rachel was visibly shaken, and Mark felt a chill creep up his spine. That's when the boat began to drift, as if something beneath the water was pulling it. Panic set in. The water grew colder, the wind picked up, and the once clear sky now seemed foreboding. Mark could swear he saw a figure in the water, a girl, her face pale and her hair floating around her like she was drowning. They managed to get the boat back to shore, but the image of the girl stayed with them, haunting their thoughts. Later, they learned about the legend of the drowned girl, a young woman who had drowned in the lake in the 1950s and whose body was never recovered. Locals claim her spirit lingers in the waters, luring people to their doom. Mark still swears he can hear her voice whenever he's near water, and sometimes late at night he feels her cold touch on the back of his neck. Crystal Lake, located in Michigan, has a reputation for its clear, beautiful waters. But hidden beneath its serene surface is a chilling history that has led to a number of strange occurrences over the years. In the summer of 2014, Lisa and her friends rented a lakeside cabin for a weekend of camping and relaxation. The air was warm and the quiet beauty of the lake seemed to promise peace, but there was something off about the place. The locals warned them about the area, but they shrugged it off as nothing more than local superstition. As they unpacked and settled into the cabin, they noticed an old weathered sign near the dock that read, "Do not disturb the witch." The sign appeared to be a leftover relic from some bygone era, but Lisa felt a sense of unease. They spent their first evening around a bonfire by the lake, joking and laughing, but things started to feel wrong as dusk settled in. The temperature dropped unexpectedly and the night became unnaturally still. Suddenly, Lisa heard a soft, almost imperceptible chant coming from the direction of the lake. It was an ancient-sounding language, unintelligible but haunting. At first, she thought it was the wind, but the chant grew louder and something about it felt unnatural. Her friends dismissed it as nothing more than the noises of the forest, but Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. As the night wore on, strange things began happening. Shadows flickered at the edge of the trees, their shapes moving in unnatural ways. A cold wind blew through the campsite, carrying with it the smell of damp earth and something else, something rotting. It wasn't until Lisa ventured down to the lake alone that she discovered the source of her fear. There, standing in the water, was a figure, a woman draped in tattered black robes. Her long white hair flowed like the water around her, and her face was obscured by shadows. Lisa tried to scream, but no sound came from her mouth. The woman raised a skeletal hand pointing towards the cabin before slowly sinking beneath the water, disappearing from sight. Lisa and her friends rushed back to the cabin, but the chanting persisted in the distance. The next morning they were gone, their bags left behind, their sleeping bags undisturbed, but the cabin was empty. When the police arrived and investigated, they found a series of ancient symbols carved into the cabin's foundation, symbols tied to a witch who, according to legend, drowned in Crystal Lake centuries ago, cursing anyone who dared to disturb her resting place. Lisa and her friends were never found. Lake Tahoe, straddling the border between California and Nevada, is renowned for its breathtaking views and crystal-clear waters. For Jason and his brother Tyler, it was the perfect place for a weekend getaway. The two had always bonded over their shared love of hiking and nature, and Lake Tahoe seemed like an ideal spot to relax and unwind. They rented a cabin near the lake, nestled among towering pine trees. The sun was setting as they made their way down to the water, the golden light casting long shadows over the surface of the lake. As the evening wore on, they sat by the shore, tossing rocks into the water and chatting about their childhood memories. But soon the mood shifted. The lake, once calm and serene, grew eerily still. The air grew heavy and the wind stopped, leaving an unnatural silence in its wake. It was almost as if the lake itself was holding its breath. Jason and Tyler couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but they tried to brush it off as the usual nerves of being out in the woods. Then, as they stood up to head back to the cabin, they heard something that stopped them in their tracks, a soft, distant whisper. It was barely audible, but they both heard it coming from the center of the lake. "Help me!" The voice sounded faint, as though it were coming from deep beneath the water. They called out, but there was no response. The whispering continued, growing louder with each passing moment until it felt as though the very air was vibrating with it. They stood frozen, staring out at the water, when they saw someone emerge from the depths. A pale figure, a woman, her face gaunt and her eyes wide with terror, emerged slowly from the lake. She seemed to float, moving toward them as though the water was no obstacle. Her hair was dark and matted, and her skin was gray, as though she had been submerged for far too long. Her outstretched hand reached toward them, her lips moving soundlessly, pleading. Jason and Tyler ran back to the cabin in a panic, their hearts racing. As they looked back, they saw the figure standing at the edge of the water, watching them with hollow eyes. The whispers continued, but they didn't stop to listen. They locked themselves inside and refused to leave until morning. When they left the cabin the next day, they learned from a local that the lake had a dark history years ago. A woman had drowned in those very waters under mysterious circumstances, and it was said that her spirit lingered searching for help. No one who had seen her in the water had ever returned the same. Jason and Tyler left Lake Tahoe that day, but the whispers still haunt their dreams. They say if you listen carefully, you can still hear her voice calling from the lake, waiting for someone to answer. Beaver Lake in Arkansas is often described as a peaceful hidden gem. Tucked away in the Ozarks, it offers crystal clear waters and plenty of opportunities for boating, fishing, and hiking. But in the summer of 2015, Jenny and her friends discovered that the lake had a darker side. They arrived early in the afternoon, eager to set up camp by the water. The day was hot, the air thick with humidity, and the forest around them seemed alive with the sounds of nature. As they settled in, Jenny noticed an old weather-beaten boat tied to the dock, a strange sight considering there were no other campers around. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. Jenny shrugged it off, figuring it was left behind by previous visitors, but the oddity stuck in the back of her mind. As evening approached, the group gathered around a campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. But the peaceful night was disrupted when Jenny heard something, a soft, steady tapping sound, like someone knocking on wood. At first she thought it was an animal, but the sound grew louder as though someone was tapping on the wooden dock. Jenny got up to investigate, but when she reached the dock, there was no one there. The boat, however, was gently rocking as if it had been disturbed. It was then that her friend Sarah spoke up. "Do you know the story of the man who drowned here?" she asked. Jenny, feeling an eerie chill, turned to look at her. Sarah explained that years ago a man had drowned in Beaver Lake under mysterious circumstances. He had been fishing alone when his boat capsized, but when they found his body, his hands were covered in strange scratches. Locals whispered that the man's soul had become trapped in the lake and that sometimes on quiet nights you could hear him knocking on the docks trying to get someone's attention. Jenny didn't believe the story, but as the night wore on, the tapping grew louder and more persistent. It felt as if something was trying to get inside their cabin. Panicking, Jenny and her friends rushed to leave the area. But as they made their way down to the dock, they noticed something chilling, footprints in the mud leading from the water's edge to the dock. The prints were fresh, yet there was no one in sight. Jenny's heart raced and she turned to leave when she heard it, a loud, hollow knock followed by a voice, faint but unmistakable. "Help me." She never returned to Beaver Lake, and to this day she refuses to speak of what happened that night. The locals still tell the story of the man who drowned in the lake, and how he calls out to anyone who dares to venture too close to the water's edge. Lake Michigan, with its vast expanse of water and miles of pristine coastline, is a popular destination for boaters, fishermen, and beachgoers alike. But in the summer of 2018, Tyler and his girlfriend Emily found that sometimes the lake can hold more than just water. It can hold memories and maybe even ghosts. They had spent the day on the beach enjoying the warmth of the sun and the cool breeze off the water. As evening approached, they decided to rent a small boat to watch the sunset over the lake. It was the perfect evening, calm waters reflecting the vibrant colors of the sky. But as they drifted farther from the shore, the mood began to change. The air grew heavier, and a thick fog began to roll in, blanketing the water. The sun disappeared behind the horizon, leaving the lake in an eerie half-light. Emily felt uneasy, but Tyler brushed it off as just a change in the weather. As the fog thickened, they noticed something strange, a dim light coming from a boat in the distance. It wasn't a headlamp or a flashlight, but a soft, glowing light like a lantern flickering on the water. Tyler, curious, steered their boat toward the light. The closer they got, the more they realized something was wrong. The boat was empty. The light was coming from an old-fashioned lantern, swaying back and forth, but no one was aboard. As they approached, the boat seemed to grow larger and the air grew colder. Emily was suddenly overcome with a sense of dread, and she urged Tyler to turn back. But as they turned to leave, the boat's lantern flickered out and the fog thickened even more. They could no longer see the shoreline, and the water around them became unnervingly still. It was then that they heard its soft, desperate whispers coming from all directions. The whispers seemed to rise from the water itself, and they felt the boat move as if something beneath the surface was pulling it. Panic set in. Tyler tried to start the motor, but it sputtered and died. Emily screamed as the whispers grew louder, now joined by a distant, sorrowful wail. Suddenly the fog lifted, revealing the boat again. This time the lantern was swinging violently as though someone invisible was shaking it. Tyler managed to restart the motor and they raced back toward the shore. They didn't stop until they reached the safety of the dock. When they later asked the locals about the strange boat, they were told a chilling tale. A fisherman had drowned in those waters decades ago, and some say his spirit still haunts the lake, trying to guide lost souls to their watery graves. Emily and Tyler left Lake Michigan that night, but Emily swears that every time she hears the sound of a boat motor in the distance, she can still hear the faint whispering from the water. Shasta Lake in California is a popular spot for tourists, known for its crystal-clear waters and stunning views. However, there is a dark history that lurks beneath the surface, one that was revealed to Sarah during a camping trip with her friends in the summer of 2017. They had rented a small houseboat for the weekend, planning to spend their time swimming, fishing, and enjoying the tranquil beauty of the lake. The morning sun reflected off the water and the air was warm, but a strange unease settled over Sarah the moment they reached the dock. The houseboat was a bit older, but it had a charm to it. The wood smelled like fresh pine and the boat creaked as they loaded their bags. As the boat set sail out onto the lake, everything seemed perfect. They swam in the cool water, drank beers on the deck, and laughed as the hours passed by. But that night things began to change. As the sun set, a thick fog rolled in, covering the lake and surrounding shoreline. The atmosphere shifted from serene to eerie, and a sense of foreboding began to creep over Sarah. She noticed a small figure standing at the water's edge, staring out at the lake. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, but when she looked closer, she saw a woman standing there in a white dress, her hair floating in the breeze. The woman appeared to be looking for something or someone. Sarah turned to her friends to point out the figure, but when she looked back, the woman was gone. The others dismissed it as a trick of the light, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. That night they anchored the boat and tried to sleep, but the faint sound of crying carried across the water. The soft, sorrowful sobs seemed to come from the distance, but there was no one else around. Sarah woke to the sound of the crying again in the early morning hours. She stepped out on deck to find the water unnervingly still, the lake as silent as a tomb. Then she saw the woman again, standing near the shore, gazing out at the water. In a panic, Sarah rushed to wake her friends, but when they came outside, the woman was gone. The cries had stopped. The next day, when they told the local ranger about their experience, he seemed unfazed but told them the story of a woman who had drowned in the lake many years ago. She had been boating with her husband when a sudden storm capsized their boat. Her husband's body was found, but she was never recovered. Legend had it that her spirit still roamed the lake searching for her lost love, and some say that on foggy nights you could hear her cries echo across the water. Sarah and her friends left Shasta Lake as soon as they could, but to this day, every time Sarah hears the sound of water lapping at the shore, she's haunted by the image of the woman in the white dress, still waiting, still searching, forever lost in the fog. Devil's Lake in Wisconsin is a beautiful, picturesque spot surrounded by tall bluffs and a calm, clear surface. But for the group of college friends who decided to camp there one summer in 2019, their relaxing getaway would turn into a nightmare they would never forget. Amy, John, Sarah, and Marcus had been looking forward to the trip for months. They had planned everything down to the last detail: tents, camping gear, and a cooler stocked with drinks. The sun was setting when they arrived, casting a golden glow over the lake. The weather was perfect and the air was fresh, filled with the scent of pine and earth. The campground was secluded, far from the crowds, and it was the ideal spot for a peaceful weekend of hiking and stargazing. After a long hike, they set up camp by the water's edge and started a fire, roasting marshmallows and telling jokes. As night fell, the peaceful sounds of nature surrounded them: the crackling of the fire, the rustling of the leaves, and the occasional splash of fish jumping in the lake. But as they were sitting around the fire, Amy noticed something strange. A faint red tint spreading across the surface of the water, almost as though it was being painted with blood. She thought her eyes were playing tricks on her and shrugged it off, but soon John noticed it too. The water appeared unnaturally still, and the red hue grew more pronounced. They all looked at each other nervously, but before anyone could speak, the ground beneath them trembled and a distant howl echoed through the trees. At first they thought it was an animal, but the sound didn't belong to anything they recognized. The howl seemed to carry with it an ominous, unsettling energy. It was then that they heard something even more chilling: footsteps crunching in the dry leaves, slow and deliberate, as if someone or something was walking toward them from the direction of the lake. Frozen in fear, they stared toward the water, and that's when they saw it, a figure emerging from the lake, dripping wet and blood-soaked. It was a man, his clothes tattered, his face twisted in agony, and his eyes wide with terror. The man reached out toward them, mouthing words they couldn't understand, and before they could react, he collapsed into the water, his body sinking beneath the surface. Panic set in as they realized the lake was not what it seemed. The strange red color in the water intensified, swirling as though the lake itself was alive. Terrified, they gathered their belongings and tried to leave, but the path leading back to the parking area had disappeared. The trees now towered over them, closing in, and the air became thick with an oppressive heat. They were trapped. The footsteps followed them, the sound growing louder, but there was no one there. Finally, they heard the distant cry of the man echoing across the lake. They ran in desperation, not stopping until they reached the car. But when they turned around to look at the lake one last time, they saw the man standing at the edge, staring back at them, his face twisted in a grotesque smile. They later found out that the lake's name, Devil's Lake, was tied to a grim history decades ago. A brutal murder had taken place near the water. A man had murdered his wife, dumping her body into the lake, and some say that her spirit, along with the blood of the tragedy, still haunts the waters to this day. Amy and her friends never returned to Devil's Lake, but Amy still hears the sound of the man's cry sometimes in her dreams, as if the lake's spirits have followed her, waiting, watching, and calling for her to return.